The numbers are hard to wrap your head around. On a single day, July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered over 57,000 casualties. Let that sink in for a moment. In just a few hours, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, nearly 20,000 young men were killed. Entire battalions, made up of friends, neighbors, and brothers who had signed up together, were simply erased. The sheer scale of that loss, so immediate and so vast, makes it the bloodiest single day in the history of the British military. And that was just one day, in one battle, of a war that dragged on for more than 4 years. This isn't just going to be a list of statistics. We want to understand the why. Why was the First World War so uniquely horrifying? It started with cavalry charges and ended with tanks and poison gas, redrawing the world map and shattering old empires. But at its heart, this was a war of trenches. From the Swiss Alps to the North Sea, millions of men lived and died in a hellish landscape of mud, barbed wire, and steel. This stalemate gave rise to a horrifying new type of war, the battle of attrition. Commanders, unable to land a decisive blow, turned to a grim and bloody math. They threw wave after wave of men at entrenched positions, believing they could win by simply bleeding the enemy dry. This thinking produced some of the most lethal battles in all of human history. So, today, we're journeying into the heart of these conflicts to explore the strategies, the personal stories, and the devastating consequences of the battles that came to define the First World War. Before the Somme became a synonym for slaughter, there was Verdun. For the French, Verdun is a name that echoes with an almost sacred meaning. It was a battle that raged for 10 agonizing months in 1916, making it the longest of the war, and it was born from a chillingly deliberate German strategy, attrition. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, believed the war would be won or lost in France. His theory, if he could attack a place so important to the French psyche that they couldn't possibly let it fall, they'd be forced to throw every man they had into its defense. His goal wasn't to capture the ancient fortress city of Verdun, but to bleed France white. He chose his target perfectly. Verdun was a symbol of French defiance, a fortress that had stood against German aggression for centuries. Losing it would be an unimaginable blow to French morale. Falkenhayn planned to turn this symbol of pride into a meat grinder, using Germany's superior artillery to exsanguinate the French army. The attack kicked off on February 21, 1916. With an artillery bombardment so intense the world had never seen anything like it. Over 1,200 German guns unleashed a hurricane of steel. The landscape was obliterated, forests were reduced to splinters, and the ground was churned into a lunar wasteland. Men weren't just killed, they were vaporized, buried alive, or driven mad by the non-stop, earth-shattering explosions. An estimated 70% of the casualties at Verdun were caused by artillery fire. In the first few days, the German advance was terrifyingly swift. They seized key French forts, including the legendary Fort Douaumont, which fell without a fight to a small German patrol. The French high command panicked. For a moment, it looked like Falkenhayn's gruesome strategy might actually work. But then, a new commander was put in charge of Verdun's defense. General Philippe saw exactly what the Germans were doing. His most critical move was organizing the Noria system, a constant flow of trucks along a single vital road into Verdun that became known as the Sacred Way, 24 hours a day. Some 6,000 trucks ferried fresh troops and supplies to the front while carrying the wounded away. The Noria system ensured that French divisions weren't just left in the furnace of Verdun to be wiped out. Instead, they were rotated through the front lines, meaning that by the end of the battle, a huge portion of the entire French army had served time at Verdun, turning it into a national ordeal. The fighting descended into a hellish close-quarters struggle for shattered forts and ravaged hills. Places named Le Mort, Somme, and Kate 304 became infamous for the slaughter. Soldiers fought in a landscape of mud and corpses. As one French soldier wrote, "I have returned from the most terrible ordeal I have ever witnessed. For days and 4 nights, in ice-cold mud, I arrived with 175 men. I returned with 34. By summer, the German offensive was faltering. The strategy of bleeding France white had become a double-edged sword. The German army was bleeding to death right alongside the French. When the Battle of the Somme began in July, Germany had to pull troops and guns away from Verdun. That autumn, the French launched counteroffensives, retaking much of the ground they had lost, including the symbolic Fort Douaumont. When the battle finally ended in December, the front lines were almost exactly where they had been 10 months before, but the cost was astronomical. The most reliable estimates place the total casualties for both sides at around 714,000, with roughly 300,000 men killed. Falkenhayn's mincing machine had devoured both armies with almost equal ferocity. Verdun became the ultimate symbol of attritional warfare, a horrifying testament to human endurance, and a permanent scar on the soul of France. While the inferno of Verdun was raging, the Allies were planning their own massive offensive. The Battle of the Somme, which kicked off on July 1, 1916, was supposed to be a joint Anglo-French operation to finally break through the German lines. But with the French army being bled white at Verdun, the battle fell largely on the shoulders of the British. And for Britain, the Somme would become what Verdun was for France, the most defining and tragic battle of the war. The plan, devised by General Sir Douglas Haig, was based on a simple, and as it turned out, tragically flawed idea. For an entire week, a massive artillery bombardment, over 1.5 million shells, was supposed to completely obliterate the German defenses. After that, the infantry would simply walk across no man's land and occupy the shattered trenches. On paper, it looked sound. The reality, it catastrophically underestimated the enemy. The German defenders had built deep, shell-proof dugouts. When the bombardment started, they just went underground to wait it out. To make matters worse, many of the British shells were duds, or were the wrong type to cut through barbed wire. So, on the morning of July 1st, when the barrage lifted, German machine gunners scrambled out of their shelters, set up their weapons, and stared out at the field they knew the British were about to cross. At 7:30 a.m., whistles blew. Tens of thousands of British soldiers, weighed down with heavy gear, climbed out of their trenches and advanced at a walking pace just as they'd been drilled. They expected to find nothing but ruins. Instead, they walked into a perfect storm of machine gun and artillery fire that tore them to shreds. The result was the deadliest day in British military history. Of the 120,000 soldiers who attacked, 57,470 became casualties, with 19,240 killed. The losses were especially gut-wrenching for the PALS battalion's units, made up of men from the same towns and offices who had all enlisted together. The Accrington Pals, for instance, sent 720 men over the top. Within 20 minutes, 584 of them had been killed or wounded. The grief from that one day would haunt British communities for generations. Even after this unmitigated disaster, Haig refused to call off the offensive. The battle ground on for another 4.5 months, turning into the same kind of brutal attritional slog as Verdun. This is where the tank made its battlefield debut in September. These early machines were slow and unreliable, but they offered a glimpse into the future of war. When the battle was finally halted by the winter weather in mid-November, the Allies had advanced a mere 5 or 6 miles. The cost for this tiny patch of ravaged earth was staggering. Total casualties for both sides topped 1 million. The British and Commonwealth forces suffered around 420,000 casualties, the French 200,000, and the Germans around 450,000 to 500,000. Strategically, the Somme failed to achieve a breakthrough. But military historians argue it wasn't a total failure. It did relieve the pressure on the French at Verdun and inflicted irreplaceable losses on the German army. The brutal lessons learned at the Somme about tactics and technology would eventually contribute to the Allied victory in 1918. But for the men who fought there, the Somme was simply a bloody holocaust, a name synonymous with mud, futility, and immeasurable loss. If Verdun was the battle of fire and the Somme the battle of futility, then the third battle of Ypres forever, known as Passchendaele, was the battle of mud, fought from July to November 1917. It has become the ultimate symbol of the nightmarish misery of the Western Front. The name alone conjures images of a blasted, waterlogged wasteland where men and horses drowned in a sea of liquid earth. The goal, once again pushed by Sir Douglas Haig, was to break out of the Ypres salient in Belgium, capture the high ground of the Passchendaele Ridge, and then push on to the Belgian coast to seize German U-boat bases. It was meant to be a war-winning move. The battle began on July 31st, 1917, with an artillery bombardment even bigger than the one at the Somme. But this colossal barrage had an unforeseen, catastrophic side effect. It completely destroyed the drainage systems of the low-lying Flanders landscape. And on the very first day of the infantry attack, the heaviest rains in 30 years began to fall. The shattered earth and torrential rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire. The ground became a vast, porridge-like swamp, filled with waterlogged shell craters. Wooden duckboards were laid down so troops could move, but slipping off could be a death sentence. Men, mules, and even tanks vanished into the thick mud, drowning under the weight of their gear. The wounded were often left to die where they fell, slowly sinking into the muck. The Germans had also perfected their defense in depth, using concrete pillboxes that were nearly impossible to destroy without a direct hit. Allied attacks became brutal bite-and-hold operations, a limited advance to capture a small piece of the German line, followed by a desperate defense against the inevitable counterattack. A soldier named Private J.W. Palmer described the horror. "One of my pals, he just slid into a shell hole. We tried to get him out. The more we pulled, the more he went down. He said, 'For God's sake, shoot me.' But we couldn't shoot him. We had to leave him there." That was the reality of Passchendaele. Despite the appalling conditions and horrific casualties, Haig pressed on. Australian, New Zealand, and Canadian troops were brought in to continue the assault. The final objective, the ruined village of Passchendaele, took on a symbolic importance that far outweighed its strategic value. It was finally captured by Canadian forces on November 6. The price for this victory was astronomical. For an advance of just 5 miles, casualty estimates vary widely, but most historians believe the Allies and Germans each suffered between 250,000 and 300,000 casualties, with some estimates going even higher. The battle completely failed to achieve its strategic goal, and the ground that was gained at such a terrible cost was given up with little resistance during the German spring offensive the following year. Passchendaele remains a monument to the suffering of the common soldier in a landscape that had been turned into a vision of hell on earth. While the Western Front was locked in its bloody trench warfare stalemate, the fighting on the Eastern Front was a different beast entirely. The front was longer and more fluid, with huge armies maneuvering across the vast plains of Eastern Europe. Here, Russia was fighting the combined forces of Germany and Austria-Hungary, and in the summer of 1916, at the same time as Verdun and the Somme, the Eastern Front saw one of the most successful and lethal offensives of the entire war, the Brusilov offensive. By 1916, the Russian army had taken a beating, but a new commander, General Alexei Brusilov, had a bold idea. At the time, military doctrine said you should concentrate your attack on a narrow front. Brusilov threw that out the window. He planned to attack along a massive 300-mile front to confuse the enemy and stop them from shifting reserves to plug any one hole. The offensive launched on June 4, 1916. Brusilov's innovative tactics, using short, sharp bombardments followed by surprise infantry assaults, worked spectacularly. The Austro-Hungarian army, which took the main force of the attack, was shattered. Within days, Russian forces had advanced for dozens of miles and taken hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The scale of the disaster for the Central Powers was huge. The Brusilov offensive forced Germany to pull crucial divisions from the Western Front, giving the French desperately needed relief at Verdun. It was so successful, it even convinced a neutral Romania to join the war on the Allied side. But this success came at a terrible price. The offensive bled the Russian army white. While it inflicted devastating losses on the Austro-Hungarian Somme, estimates place their casualties as high as 1.5 million. The Russians themselves suffered somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million casualties. In terms of total casualties, it was one of the deadliest campaigns of the war. The Brusilov offensive was a stunning tactical victory for Russia, but it turned into a strategic catastrophe. The army was exhausted and had suffered losses it simply couldn't replace. The enormous cost in men and materiel, on top of growing unrest back home, helped fuel the collapse of the Tsarist regime and the Russian revolutions of 1917. In a tragic twist of fate, Russia's greatest military victory of the war helped pave the way for its own internal collapse and eventual exit from the conflict. By early 1918, the war was at a tipping point. Russia had collapsed, freeing up nearly 50 German divisions to be moved to the Western Front for the German High Command. Led by General Erich Ludendorff, this was their last chance. They had to win the war before the full power of the United States, which had joined in 1917, could be brought into play. This desperation gave birth to the Kaiserschlacht, or Kaiser's Battle, better known as the German Spring Offensive. Launched on March 21, 1918, it was a series of 5 massive attacks. The Germans unleashed new tactics, using highly trained stormtroopers to bypass Allied strongpoints and create chaos in the rear. The initial attack was a stunning success. Aided by thick fog, German forces punched through the British lines and advanced up to 40 miles, the biggest gain on the Western Front since 1914. For a brief moment, it looked like Germany might actually win the war, but the offensive couldn't be sustained. The Germans suffered huge casualties, especially among their elite stormtroopers. They outran their supply lines, and the Allied armies, now under the unified command of French General Ferdinand Foch, scrambled to plug the gaps. The spring offensive was Germany's last roll of the dice, and it had failed. It was also one of the war's costliest campaigns, with total casualties for both sides reaching around 1.5 million men. The German army was spent. The Allied response was swift and decisive. On August 8, 1918, they launched a counteroffensive at Amiens. This marked the start of the 100 Days Offensive, the final Allied push that would end the war. Using a coordinated assault of infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft, the Allies shattered the German lines. This victory kicked off a relentless series of Allied attacks all along the Western Front. The once unbreakable Hindenburg Line was breached, and the German army was pushed all the way back. This final campaign was also one of the bloodiest. In their desperate retreat, the Germans fought hard. The 100 Days Offensive resulted in over 1.8 million casualties combined. The history of these battles is vast, filled with countless stories of heroism and tragedy. If you find these deep dives into military history compelling and want to see more, please consider subscribing to the channel and ringing the bell. And let us know in the comments which aspect of these battles you find the most powerful. From the blood-soaked hills of Verdun to the muddy fields of Passchendaele, the great battles of World War I were a turning point in human history. They were clashes on a scale that was previously unimaginable, fueled by industry and fought with terrifying new weapons. The strategy of attrition, born from a desperate stalemate, led to the slaughter of millions. These battles weren't just names on a map. They were crucibles that forged and broke entire nations, leaving behind a legacy of trauma and disillusionment that shaped the rest of the 20th century. The endless rows of white crosses that now stand silent guard across France and Belgium are a permanent reminder of the immense human cost. Yet, amid all the horror, these battles also show the evolution of modern warfare. The failures of 1916 and 1917 led to innovations in tactics like the creeping barrage and combined arms warfare that ultimately broke the deadlock and led to victory in 1918.